Morning, everyone. Welcome to this latest post-Brexit clinic, which we're bringing to you from Queen's University, Belfast, as part of the post-Brexit governance NI project that we're running here. I'm David Phinnemore, and I'm chairing today's proceedings. What you probably should be aware of is we're pre-recording this, and so there won't be a Q&A session at the end, but we will be with you live when this goes out tomorrow to answer your questions. So please do put those in the YouTube comment box on screen. Okay, as I say, you're very welcome to this latest clinic. It's a clinic which takes place in a very interesting context with regard to the implementation of the Protocol Windsor Framework, insofar as very recently at the end of January, we got the Safeguarding the Union command paper from the UK government and the deal with the DUP, which led to the restoration of the Assembly and then the swearing in of a new executive. So for the first time in the implementation of the protocol, we actually have a functioning set of institutions in Northern Ireland. Okay, what we want to do with you today is run through a number of things. One, to say a few words about what has been agreed in the Safeguarding the Union command paper. I'm going to say a few words on that, and my colleague Billy is going to come in on particularly the trade aspects of that. And then what we're going to do is turn to the latest findings from the testing the temperature polling that we've been doing as part of the project. That polling was conducted immediately after the command paper was issued, so we've managed to include some questions there, and my colleague Katy Hayward is going to talk us through some of the key findings of that. Today we published that, and it will be available online, and we'll circulate details to you. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to start. I want to say a few words about what is in the Safeguarding the Union paper. We do have an explainer, which Katy and I wrote last week, and which is available. And again, we'll send you detail or share with you details of where you can find that. Key elements within the paper were essentially a set of arrangements designed to reassure particularly unionists about some of their concerns with regard to the Windsor Framework Protocol and its implications for Northern Ireland's position within the UK, particularly the internal market. Okay, so when you look at the paper, what you'll see is there's a number of statements there, essentially limiting what the UK can do in the future with regard to the introduction of any new agreements with the EU, which might actually undermine Northern Ireland's position in the UK. So, for example, setting out essentially a prohibition on any UK-EU agreement that leads to some new regulatory border. To assuage some of the concerns, we also have a series of new bodies and structures being set up. You'll see them listed there, an independent monitoring panel to look at the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, what's happening with the regulation, and various other working bodies, including one importantly on the veterinary medicines, which is one of the issues which the Safeguarding the Union paper did not address, at least not to the satisfaction of some of the critics of the arrangements that are in place. So Billy's going to talk us through some of the rather complicated issues with regard to trade and Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market. What we then have in the paper is a set of arrangements relating to the role of the Northern Ireland Assembly, in particular around its the votes it can have and will have this year. In terms of can have, it's got the Stormont Break, which is now actually entered into force. It is now in place in law. And the arrangements there would essentially allow MLAs to initiate a process which could lead to certain EU acts not applying. And what the UK government does in the command paper is provide reassurances about how that process is to operate and how the UK government is going to support MLAs in analysing what is coming through from the EU under the Windsor Framework. What we also have there is a reminder in the command paper that later this year, MLAs will be voting on the future of core elements of the Windsor Framework, notably those governing the movement of goods. And in that vote, if consent is given to the continuation of those arrangements, and it's only by a simple majority of MLAs, there will now be a review of the Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements. That was originally going to take place 2 years after the vote, or within 2 years after the vote. Now it's been brought forward to 6 months after the vote. And we'll also include a number of other issues which weren't originally part of that process. Importantly too, the UK government has made a commitment that whatever recommendations come out of that review, they will be taken to the European Union and they will be explained to the joint committee which the UK and the EU have to oversee the implementation of the protocol. We also know from the command paper there are a number of issues still to be addressed. One of them is the whole question of veterinary medicines. What we've also due to see is some additional legislation coming through, particularly some legislation essentially removing any statutory duties the UK government has towards supporting an all-island economy on the island of Ireland. Okay. Open question for some is whether the contents of this command paper and the deal with the DUP do safeguard the union. We're still at very early stages. We're still to see the full implementation of the command paper, and it's certainly something that we will be keeping an eye on. Okay, so some of the elements there of what's in that paper. As I said, we've written an explainer on it, and we'll share that with you. But I think one of the key focuses of many people has been on what's happening with regard to trade and the movement of goods. So I'm going to hand over now to Billy to talk us through some of those elements that are in the command paper.
Right, so I'll say a few words about the trade component of the UK command paper. And really this could be a very short presentation because whilst the command paper says a lot, when you dig a bit deeper, it looks like it doesn't really add that much in practice. And the reason why I say this is that a lot of the supposed reforms that are being introduced through the command paper are really just a repackaging of reforms that were achieved via the Windsor framework or that are the result of the implementation of the Windsor framework. So an example, the UK includes a commitment to prohibit export procedures on goods that are moving from Northern Ireland to GB. That was something that was achieved via the Windsor framework and actually achieved via an amendment of the EU Customs Code. And the same thing with respect to the UK's commitment to reduce customs paperwork on GB goods coming into Northern Ireland. There are some reform proposals which are more focused on the domestic arena, whether there are regulatory reforms or changes in policy positions. But again, these are things that could have been achieved without even with the Windsor framework or during the era of the protocol. So these are things that could have been achieved by the UK immediately post-Brexit, but chose not to do so. So a good example of that is the application of checks on goods from the Republic of Ireland, or the UK's commitment to include a guarantee that the market access principles in the UK Internal Market Act, so the non-discrimination principle and the principle of mutual recognition, will be applied to Northern Ireland. It's very difficult to determine how that adds anything to the current regime, since Northern Ireland already benefits from these principles under the UK Internal Market Act. And in reality, it has a privileged position within the UK Internal Market Act. So what I'll do instead is I'll focus on two areas where I think there is some added value and there is an aspect of novelty in terms of what's being spoken about in the command paper. One of them hasn't been really discussed much, but I think there is a potential for some element of controversy, and the other one is actually a very good success story. So I'll start with controversy with the UK Internal Market Guarantee. And at this stage, it's really a political commitment by the UK to ensure that at least 80% of goods moved from GB to Northern Ireland are not considered to be at risk of moving onto the EU and therefore don't have to pay EU tariffs. It's not entirely clear, based on the command paper, how they reach that 80% target. I know this is on purely anecdotal basis. Speaking to people involved on the ground, they've expressed some skepticism about this 80% target, with some suggesting that really, unless you change the definition of what constitutes a good at risk, which would require a joint agreement by the EU and the UK, it's very unlikely that this target will be met or that this target is realistic. Now, this commitment is going to be underpinned by an institutional infrastructure which includes an independent monitoring panel, which will be there to assess GB Northern Ireland trade over 6-month periods. And if over the course of a 6-month period there is a finding that there is a decline in trade to the detriment of the UK internal market, this must be put to the government, and the government must act swiftly or respond swiftly. What that means in practice, again, it's something that we're yet to find out. So I wanted to just flag this guarantee because there is a potential there for it to create some perverse incentives. For starters, this 80% target, as I explained, it's not clear whether it's objectively justifiable. And we've seen in other policy areas where, for example, immigration, where a government has tied itself to a specific target, and that's led to poor policy making. And also, how do you determine where the decline is to the detriment of the UK internal market? It may be that the decline in GB Northern Ireland trade is completely justifiable because Northern Ireland businesses have found alternative sources of supply that are more efficient. So there are questions which arise with respect to this scheme. But as I said, we're talking about something that's been very broadly defined at this stage. So the devil's in the detail. Now for the feel-good story, the success story. One of the things that was achieved alongside the command paper was this joint agreement by the EU and the UK to allow Northern Ireland to benefit from UK tariff rate quotas, TRQs. Those of you who attend these clinics regularly will know what a TRQ is, but in case you've forgotten, this is a measure which allows imports from third countries to access a territory at a low or no tariff up to a predetermined quota, and anything above that quota is subject to a significantly higher tariff. Mostly it applies to agricultural products, but it's not exclusive to the agricultural sector. Now, until recently, Northern Ireland was pretty much excluded from UK TRQs, and that was a consequence of the at-risk regime as it was established under the protocol. This agreement between the EU and the UK tries to address that by listing a number of imports, quite a significant and extensive list of imports, which are covered both by EU-UK TRQs, where Northern Ireland businesses can now benefit from UK TRQs, including those that were negotiated and secured in the context of UK FTAs, these post-Brexit FTAs. There are some conditions. You have to be registered with the TTS. You have to apply for access to the TRQs. But overall, this is a good example of how, in the post-Windsor framework environment, the EU and UK have worked together to facilitate GB Northern Ireland trade, and more importantly, to enhance Northern Ireland's position and status within the UK internal market and the UK external trade regime. So I think that's it for me, and I'll pass over to Katy.
Thanks, Billy. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting the results of our latest poll. This is the 10th Testing the Temperature poll, in addition to that extra one that we conducted after the Windsor framework. And as David has said, this was taken immediately after the details of the Safeguarding the Union deal were announced, and across the same weekend as we saw the Assembly reconvene and the Executive formed. I want to thank, on behalf of the whole team, to thank Lucid Talk and Bill White for allowing us to make changes to the questions necessarily at short notice, and also for the addition of a few new questions specifically on the deal. So it's some really interesting data that we have. So the poll received just under 3,000 responses with a sample of just over 1,200, and the margin of error is plus or minus 2.3%. Just to show you this originally, at the beginning, we did receive a high number of qualitative comments, around 500 or so. What's striking from that data is quite how many people weren't really commenting about the protocol or Windsor framework, or even necessarily about the deal. There's a lot of concern around democracy in Northern Ireland and the stability of the institutions, a lot of criticism of having not had these institutions functioning for some time. So that data is very interesting and shows how lively the engagement has been on those broader political questions. So to our typical data that followers of our clinics are familiar with now. So we asked the first set of questions around opinion on the protocol and the Windsor framework. The headline finding, I guess, is that there hasn't been a dramatic change in views about the Protocol Windsor framework post-DUP deal. You can see from the red lines there that there's been very little movement really on that front. There's remarkable stability. Where we see a slight drop is in relation to people saying they have a good understanding, possibly, as we're seeing, because it's getting more and more complicated as we go on. But generally speaking, the findings are very consistent over time. To look into detail at that, so again, you've seen this earlier versions of this slide before, so people thinking that the protocol with the Windsor framework and now with the DUP deal is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. The Windsor framework made a key difference in that in terms of decreasing opposition to the protocol or thinking it was a bad thing. And that decrease in opposition has continued post-DUP deal, but people haven't been moving towards more support for the protocol Windsor framework. They've simply sort of moved into that, well, I'm going to wait and see, say neutral or don't know in that respect. When it comes to the impact of the protocol and the effects that it has across a range of measures, again, we don't see any dramatic change. The most significant change has really been in terms of its perceived negative impact on political stability in Northern Ireland. And this is probably very much in relation to people being caught up in the moment of that weekend of seeing the institutions restored and some glimmer of hope that there might yet be some more stability here. We see a slight increase in those thinking that it has a positive impact on protecting the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. We see very much overall there's a sense that it has a positive impact on the economy, but again, no dramatic movement. You might be interested to see this slide where we've done that time series analysis from our first polls in the spring of 2021, just after the protocol came into effect. And you can see this way that there has been a decline in the view that the protocol is having a negative effect. So even though overall there isn't a sense that it's necessarily positive, perhaps with the exception of the impact on the economy of Northern Ireland, we have seen decline in those perceptions that it's having a negative impact across a range of things. Again, here from this slide, you can see the biggest change has come post-Windsor framework. That's when we saw the big shift there. And you can see from this too, again, the difference made by this latest deal in views on it having a negative impact on political stability. Also there, when you look at the change over time from spring 21 in views on Northern Ireland's constitutional place in the UK, again, particular concern for the DUP. We've seen that there's been a shift from 66 to 37% in terms of people thinking that it has a negative impact. As you are probably aware, at the end of this year, there will be a vote in the Assembly amongst MLAs on whether to continue with the full package of the protocol or whether Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol should be changed. We've been asking a question since our first polls on that democratic consent vote. How would people like their MLAs to vote? So you can see originally it was more or less evenly split, and then there was just a 10% percentage points difference in people's views on whether they wanted MLAs to vote in favour or against the continuation of Articles 5 to 10. The Windsor framework last year made a very significant difference in that. Where we see a clear majority now want MLAs to vote in favour of continuing Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol. The deal that we saw there with the DUP hasn't made much of a difference, but we have seen a slight decline just above the margin of error there in terms of those who would like their MLAs to vote against. And you also know we ask continually the question on trust in the institutions and parties to manage Northern Ireland's interests with respect to the protocol Windsor framework. Unfortunately, we haven't seen, we've seen a drop again in trust in the UK government. It went up to 7%, it's back down now to 4%. Significant amount of distrust still in the British government, despite its considerable efforts with respect to safeguarding the Union command paper. Where we have seen change since the last poll is a doubling of views in trust in the Northern Ireland Executive. Now, it's not up to very much. It's still just 25%. Now, that's probably because this time around we actually do have a Northern Ireland Executive to have placed some trust in. Another significant change has been a drop in trust of the DUP and TUV, and perhaps less than might have been feared, but that is notable. No other significant changes really in terms of from the October poll to this one. One thing we've been really concerned to try and find out more about is where people rank the Protocol Windsor framework in terms of issues that matter to them. And the way that we've tried to do it this time is to ask people to rank a list of priorities that we'd set out for them in order of priority 1 to 10. And this is our means of trying to assess where these things come in terms of people's concerns. And essentially what we've landed on is a way of showing just quite how much the clear majority of people prioritise health and social care provision, including with respect to mental health provision, and the economy, employment, cost of living concerns. They are really stand out in terms of priorities for the majority of people, followed by public service delivery, etc. The protocol comes down the list. For 65% of people, it's in the bottom 4 concerns. And what is notable, though, when we look in more detail at the data, and you'll see this from our report, this is different for strong unionists who do place the protocol high up of their list of concerns. Relating to this is the question of how significant Brexit and the Windsor framework continue to be in political debate. And again, we do see a difference there amongst people of different political persuasions. So although 62% of people say it's time to move on, we're tired of talking about the Brexit and the Windsor framework, we'd like to talk about other issues, such as listed in the previous slide. But that's not a view shared by everybody by any means. And we can see amongst strong unionists there that just over half of them disagree that political debate should move on now. So this indicates that we could expect to see Protocol Windsor framework, Brexit debates continuing to be raised by strong unionists, including now, of course, within the Assembly. Which brings me to the last slide on the Stormont break. So as David has already mentioned, there is that mechanism that now exists post-Windsor framework for MLAs to try and exercise some control of what updates to EU legislation can apply in Northern Ireland. And we see here that the majority of people do not want their MLAs to exercise the Stormont break regardless of the consequences, where we do have 32% of people saying that they should. So the question we asked was, do you want to see your MLA exercise regardless of political or practical consequences? So you can see for some people it's important that MLAs have that mechanism to use and they want to see them exercise it. Again, from that bar chart there, you can see that this is a particular wish from strong unionists, that they're particularly keen to see MLAs exercise that Stormont break mechanism regardless of the consequences, which is a suitable note for me to conclude on, given that I would now just flag our explainers, and I'll leave David to mention his explainer with Lisa Whitten on the Stormont break.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. Before I just say a few final words, can I just remind everybody that we are with you while this is taking place to answer your questions. So do put those questions into the YouTube comments and we will get back to you. As Katie said, we've been doing a little bit of work since Safeguarding the Union came out. The timing was very good as far as our polling was concerned, but it did put a bit of pressure on us to start beginning to explain some things. So we've got one explainer there, which we've recently published on safeguarding. We've got the report out today on the testing the temperature polling. Goes into more detail than we've been able to provide here. And what Lisa Claire Whitten and I have done, we've written an explainer on using the Stormont break and the various requirements for it, which will hopefully be of use to people in understanding what is a pretty complex process and set of criteria which need to be met But no doubt we're going to be hearing more about the Stormont break during the course of the year with the Assembly back up and functioning. No doubt, despite people wanting the framework and protocol to be issues which we've dealt with and possibly move on to other issues, it's going to be back later this year when we have the democratic consent vote. Before then, we're going to be doing another 2 polls. So we'll be back to present you with the finding of those. But hopefully today's given you some further insights into what's happening, giving you some food for thought. And then, as I say, please do let us have any comments and we'll try and get back to you on those. Otherwise, thanks ever so much to my colleagues for being here today to present. Thanks very much for yourselves coming along. And yeah, we look forward to your comments and also engagement in the future. So thanks very much.